What happens when your son's wife's parents invite you to New York, then leave you standing alone in their empty house? A cleaning woman told me to leave before they returned, saying I didn't know what these people were capable of. By the time I understood why, my place in my son's life was already being decided without me. While you're here, don't forget to subscribe, hit the hype button, and support this channel with a like. And tell us below. Have you ever faced something like this? The phone rang at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. I was in the workshop finishing the grain on a walnut credenza that would sell for more than most people made in 3 months. My hands smelled like linseed oil and sawdust. The light over my bench cast everything in amber. Dad? Daniel's voice sounded tight, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. Hey, kiddo. I set down the cloth and leaned against the workbench. Little late for a social call. Yeah, I know. Listen, Brielle's parents want to meet you. Properly, I mean. They're insisting you come to New York. I waited. Daniel had a tell when he was uncomfortable. He filled silence with unnecessary words. But this time, nothing came. Insisting? I finally asked. They want to do it right. Have you stay at the house, show you around the city. It's important to them. What about you? Is it important to you? A pause. Longer than it should have been. Of course it is. Look, can you make it work? Maybe next weekend? I glanced at the credenza. The buyer wasn't coming until the following Thursday. I had time. Sure, I said. Send me the details. Great. Brielle will text you everything. Flight info, address, all that. You're not picking me up? They'll arrange a car. It's easier that way. Easier. That word did a lot of work in Daniel's vocabulary these days. All right, kiddo. Tell Brielle I said thanks for thinking of me. Will do. Night, Dad. He hung up before I could say goodnight back. I stood there in my workshop, surrounded by wood and tools and the kind of silence that only comes after midnight in the country. The credenza gleamed under the light, every joint invisible, every surface smooth as water. I'd built this business from nothing after Daniel's mother passed. Built it quietly, carefully, while raising a son who thought his father just fixed chairs for grocery money. I never corrected him, never saw the point. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't have saved. Hi, Elias. So excited you're coming. Flight is Saturday, 9 a.m., attached itinerary. House address below. Can't wait. Brielle. She'd never called me Elias before. Always Mr. Korven, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I looked at the address. Upper East Side. I pulled it up on my phone, and the street view showed exactly what I expected. Pre-war limestone, black iron railings, the kind of building that whispered old money even through a screen. I went back into the house and made coffee I didn't need. The kitchen was clean, organized, mine. Every item in it chosen and placed deliberately. I'd learned early that control came from knowing exactly what you had and where it was. The coffee was bitter. I drank it anyway, standing at the counter, thinking about the way Daniel's voice had sounded. Rehearsed, careful, like he was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I thought about Brielle, 27 and sharp-edged, who'd looked at my workshop once and asked if I did this full-time or just as a hobby. I'd smiled and said full-time. She'd nodded like I'd confirmed something sad. I thought about the wedding 2 years ago, held at some country club I'd never heard of, where the photographer had taken exactly 3 pictures that included me, and none of them made the final album. I finished the coffee and rinsed the mug. Then I went to my office and pulled out the folder I kept on top of the filing cabinet. Inside were documents most people would keep in a safe. Deeds, contracts, copies of transfers I'd made years ago when Daniel was younger and struggling, when help was needed and freely given. I didn't open the folder, just touched it, reminded myself it existed, then put it back. Saturday came faster than it should have. I packed light, 1 small duffel with clean shirts, jeans, a single sport coat I kept for the rare occasions when buyers wanted to meet in person. I didn't own a suit, didn't need one. The flight was uneventful. I sat in coach, declined the overpriced sandwich, and watched the landscape below shift from farmland to sprawl to concrete. By the time we landed at LaGuardia, my phone had exactly 1 message. They're very busy today. Don't take it personally if they're not around much. Daniel. Not we're busy. They're busy. I grabbed my bag from the overhead and joined the shuffle toward the exit. The terminal smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air. Travelers moved in practice patterns, everyone knowing exactly where they needed to be. I stood near the baggage claim for a moment, checking my phone, waiting for some kind of confirmation about the car Daniel had mentioned. Nothing came. I opened the ride app and put in the address Brielle had sent. The estimate made me blink. $73 from Queens to Manhattan. I confirmed it anyway. The driver was a middle-aged guy with a thick accent and a rosary hanging from his mirror. He looked at my single bag and raised an eyebrow. "Just visiting?" he asked. Something like that. We merged onto the highway and the city rose up ahead, all glass and steel and impossible verticality. I'd been to New York exactly twice before, once for a furniture expo, once when Daniel got accepted to a tech accelerator program that fizzled out after 6 months. Both times I'd stayed in cheap hotels near Penn Station and eaten dollar pizza. This felt different. This felt like crossing into territory I wasn't meant to navigate. "Big place," the driver said, nodding toward the skyline. "Yeah." "You know the neighborhood? Upper East Side?" "Not really." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Rich neighborhood. Very rich. You got family there?" "My son married into it." He glanced at me in the mirror, taking in my worn jacket and calloused hands. "Good for him," he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. Traffic thickened as we crossed into Manhattan. The buildings pressed closer, the streets narrower. Everything moved faster here. Cars, people, even the lights seemed to hit differently. By the time we turned onto the street Brielle had given me, the whole city felt like a machine I didn't understand and wasn't meant to. The driver pulled up in front of a building that looked exactly like it had online, except bigger, more imposing. The kind of place that had a doorman who knew your name and a service entrance you weren't supposed to see. "Here you go," he said. "You need help with the bag?" I got it. I paid, tipped reasonably, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The door was 15 feet away. Black, polished, brass hardware that probably cost more than my truck. I stood there for a moment, duffel in hand, looking up at windows that gave away nothing. Then I climbed the steps and pressed the buzzer next to Langford. Nothing happened. I waited 30 seconds and tried again. Still nothing. I tried the handle. It turned easily. No code, no lock, just smooth mechanical release. The door swung open into a foyer that smelled like lemon polish and money. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty house, but something thicker, deliberate, like the space itself had been designed to swallow sound. My footsteps on the marble floor were the only noise, each one bouncing off walls covered in art I didn't recognize but knew was expensive. The foyer opened into a hallway that stretched toward the back of the house. To my left, a living room with furniture that looked like it had never been sat on. To my right, a dining room with a table that could seat 12, every chair pushed in at exactly the same distance. Everything was cream and gray and perfectly, impossibly clean. I set my bag down near the door and pulled out my phone. "Hey, I'm here," I texted Daniel. The message showed as delivered, then read, but no response came. I waited 2 minutes, then tried calling. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. "It's me," I said after the beep. "I'm at the house. Not sure where everyone is, but I'm here. Call me back." I hung up and stood there in the entryway, feeling like an intruder in a museum. There were no family photos on the walls, no shoes by the door, no mail on the side table, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here. I walked into the living room. The furniture was low and modern, all sharp angles and neutral fabric. A glass coffee table held 3 books, arranged in a perfect stack. I picked up the top one, something about architecture and light. The spine had never been cracked. On the mantel above a fireplace that probably didn't work, there were exactly 5 objects: a crystal vase, a small bronze sculpture, 2 white candlesticks, and a single framed photograph. I walked over and looked at the picture. It showed Brielle and Daniel at some charity event, both in formal wear, standing in front of a banner I couldn't quite read. They looked happy in that specific way people look happy for cameras. No wedding photo, no vacation snapshots, nothing from before or after that single moment. I checked my phone again. Nothing. The dining room was the same, pristine, untouched, performative. I walked down the hallway toward what I guessed was the kitchen. My reflection followed me in the polished surfaces. A working man in worn clothes moving through a space that made him look smaller than he was. The kitchen was massive. White marble counters, professional-grade appliances, a refrigerator that probably cost more than my truck. I opened it out of curiosity. Inside was a single shelf of items arranged like a display. Imported water, a container of organic greens, 3 bottles of wine laid horizontally. No leftovers, no condiments, nothing that suggested meals were actually prepared here. I closed it and turned around. The house was beautiful. Objectively, undeniably beautiful. And it felt like absolutely no one lived in it. I walked back to the foyer and tried Daniel again. A voicemail. This time I didn't leave a message. My text to Brielle sat unanswered too. I stared at the screen for a moment, then opened the original message with the address and scrolled up. There, 3 weeks ago. We're so glad you're finally getting to see where we live. The house is really special to my parents. I looked around the foyer again. Special. Sure. I went back to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, careful not to disturb the throw pillows arranged in some kind of design I didn't understand. The afternoon light was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I could hear the city outside, muted, distant, filtered through glass and walls and the several tax brackets that separated this building from the street. I should have felt grateful. This was the kind of place most people only saw in magazines. My son had married into this. This was his life now, or at least adjacent to it. I should have been proud. Instead, I felt like I was waiting in a lobby for an appointment that had been canceled without anyone telling me. 20 minutes passed, then 30. I checked my phone obsessively, watching the timestamp on my messages refuse to change. Daniel had read my text at 2:47. It was now 3:22. Plenty of time to respond. I stood up and explored the rest of the first floor. A study with built-in bookshelves and a desk that looked like it had been staged for a photo shoot. A powder room with hand towels so perfectly folded they couldn't have been used. Another sitting area with furniture facing a window that overlooked a small courtyard garden, barren now in late autumn. Nowhere did I see anything that belonged to Daniel. No laptop, no jacket thrown over a chair, no shoes kicked off by the door. Nothing that proved he actually lived here, even part-time. I went back to the foyer and picked up my bag. There had to be a guest room somewhere. I wasn't going to stand around like an applicant waiting for an interview. The stairs were at the back of the hallway, carpeted in something soft and expensive. I climbed them slowly, my bag bumping against my leg with each step. The second floor had the same quality of silence. Thick, intentional, expensive. 4 doors, all closed. I opened the first one. A bathroom with fixtures that gleamed like they'd just been installed. I tried the second door. A bedroom with a made bed and empty nightstands and nothing on the walls. The third was similar. The fourth was locked. I stood outside that locked door for longer than I meant to. Then I went into the first guest room and set my bag on the floor. The bed was firm, the sheets the kind of high thread count that hotels advertised. There was a clock on the dresser showing 3:41 p.m. I sat on the edge of the mattress and tried Daniel one more time. This time it didn't even ring, just went straight to voicemail like he'd turned off his phone. I set mine down next to me and leaned back against the headboard. This didn't make sense. You don't invite someone across the country, give them your address, tell them to come to the house, and then vanish. People don't do that. Not normal people, anyway. But I was starting to understand that normal wasn't the operating principle here. I closed my eyes and thought about the way Brielle had looked at my workshop, the way her mother had touched my shoulder at the wedding with fingers that barely made contact, like she was petting something she found distasteful. The way Harold, I'd met him exactly once, had shaken my hand with the kind of grip that lasted half a second and meant nothing. They'd never asked what I did for a living, never inquired about my business, my house, my life. At the wedding, Harold had talked extensively about a real estate development in Connecticut while standing 2 feet from me, and the entire conversation was directed at someone else. When I'd offered a comment about land value, he'd smiled politely and changed the subject. I'd thought at the time that I'd misread the room, said the wrong thing. Now I wondered if the room had been read perfectly and I was the wrong thing. A sound broke the silence. Footsteps below me, moving through the first floor with purpose. I stood up and walked to the doorway, listening. The steps weren't rushed, but they weren't casual either. Someone was here, someone who knew the house. I went to the stairs and looked down into the foyer. A woman stood near the front door, maybe 45, wearing jeans and a practical jacket. She had a canvas bag over her shoulder and was pulling out a ring of keys. She looked up and saw me. For a second, neither of us moved. "You're Mr. Korven," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "I am. And you are?" "Carolyn Brooks. I clean the house." She set her bag down slowly, studying me. "They didn't tell you I'd be here." "They didn't tell me much of anything," she nodded, like that confirmed something. "Yeah, they're good at that." I came down the stairs carefully, reading her expression. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked concerned. "I'm supposed to be staying here," I said. "Guest of the Langfords." "I know." She crossed her arms. "I saw the message they sent me. Make sure the guest room is ready. Leave fresh towels. Standard stuff. But..." She tilted her head slightly, considering me. Then she glanced toward the living room, then back. "How long have you been here?" "About an hour." "And no one's called you?" "No." She nodded again. "Mr. Korven, I've worked for this family for 6 years. I know how they operate, and I'm going to tell you something that's none of my business, but that you need to hear." I waited. They never invite guests when they're actually home. The words hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. Carolyn Brooks didn't look away when she said it. She held my gaze with the kind of directness that people only use when they've decided honesty matters more than consequences. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already understood. She set her keys on the side table and walked past me into the living room. I followed. She didn't sit, just stood near the window with her arms still crossed, looking at the courtyard outside. "The Langfords travel constantly," she said. "Always have. Real estate conferences, charity galas, property tours. They're never in one place for more than a few days. And when they have people over, it's always scheduled around their trips. Guests arrive after they leave, stay in the house, then leave before they get back." "Why would they do that?" She turned to look at me. "Because they're not actually hosting, they're evaluating." The word hit harder than it should have. Evaluating. "Yeah." She walked over to the mantel and adjusted one of the candlesticks by maybe a 1/4 inch. "They did it with Brielle's college roommate once. Invited her to stay for a week, said they'd be back Thursday. They didn't come back until Saturday. The roommate left Friday night, never got invited again." "That's insane." "That's rich." She said it without emotion, like she was describing the weather. "People with money like this, they don't see relationships the same way. Everything's a test. Everything's conditional. You're not a guest, Mr. Korven. You're being measured." I sat down on the arm of the couch, processing. The silence, the empty house, Daniel's careful distance, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. "What about my son?" I asked. "Daniel, does he know about this?" Carolyn's expression softened slightly, and that was somehow worse than if she'd looked dismissive. "Your son lives here sometimes," she said, "or stays here anyway. I've seen him. Nice guy. Quiet. Always picks up after himself, which is more than most people who come through here. But—" She hesitated. Then she walked over and sat in the chair across from me, leaning forward like she was about to share something that required proximity. "They argue," she said quietly. "Your son and his wife. I hear them sometimes when I'm cleaning. He wants to move out, get their own place. She says they can't afford it yet. He says they could if they tried. She says her parents are just trying to help." "And what does he say to that?" "He stops talking." Carolyn rubbed her forehead. "Look, I don't know your family. I don't know the whole situation. But I've seen this pattern before. The Langfords help people, sure, but the help comes with strings. And once you're tangled up in those strings, getting free is hard." I thought about the call on Tuesday night, Daniel's tight voice, the way he'd said, "They're insisting," instead of, "We'd love to have you," the way he'd avoided saying "we" at all. "You said there were other visitors," I prompted, "people who got evaluated and didn't pass." She nodded. "Brielle's uncle came once, brother of Mr. Langford, wanted to stay for a month while his apartment got renovated. They said yes, gave him the guest room, then left for 3 weeks. When they came back, he was still here. They were polite about it, but he was gone within a day. Never saw him at a family dinner again." "What happened?" "Far as I could tell, he didn't do anything wrong. He just existed in their space the wrong way. Left his stuff around, used the kitchen, acted like he actually lived here. They didn't like it." "How do you know that's why they cut him out?" "Because Mrs. Langford told me to strip the guest room completely after he left. Replace the sheets, the towels, even the pillows. She said she wanted everything that touched him out of the house. Those were her exact words." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Jesus." "Yeah." Carolyn stood up and walked back to the window. "So when I saw the message that you were coming and that they'd be gone all weekend, I knew what was happening, and I figured somebody should tell you before you figured it out the hard way." "Why?" I asked. "Why are you telling me this? You could lose your job." She looked at me over her shoulder. "Maybe, but I've got other clients. And honestly, Mr. Korven, I'm tired of watching people get played by folks who think money means they can treat everyone else like chess pieces." She paused. "Plus, you're Daniel's dad. He talks about you sometimes. Says you taught him how to fix things, how to work with his hands. He says it like it matters." Something in my throat tightened. "He said that?" "More than once." She turned fully to face me. "Look, I don't know what you're supposed to do with this information, but if it were me, I'd leave before they got back. Whatever test this is, you're not going to pass it by staying in their house and waiting for approval, because approval isn't the point. Control is." I stood up slowly, my mind racing through possibilities. Leave now? Prove their assumptions right? Stay, play their game, lose anyway. Call Daniel, demand an explanation that probably wouldn't come. "When do they get back?" I asked. "Tomorrow evening, 7 or 8 usually." "And Daniel?" She shrugged. "He comes and goes. Could be here tomorrow, could be at their apartment downtown. Hard to say. Their apartment, meaning Brielle's apartment, meaning another property owned or controlled by her parents. I walked to the foyer and looked at my duffel bag still sitting by the door where I'd left it. All my worldly possessions for this trip, fitting into one small bag, proof of my impermanence. Carolyn followed me out. "I've got work to do upstairs," she said. "But Mr. Korven, one more thing." I turned. "They're not bad people," she said carefully. "They donate to charities, they're polite to staff, they don't yell or make scenes, but they're used to getting what they want, and they're very, very good at making sure everyone knows their place. If you're not in their bracket, you're not in their world, and they have a way of making that clear without ever saying it out loud." "I've noticed." She gave me a sad smile. "Yeah, I bet you have. Good luck, Mr. Korven. Whatever you decide." She climbed the stairs with her cleaning supplies, leaving me alone in the foyer again. But this time the silence felt different. It wasn't just empty. It was hostile. I picked up my phone and looked at the unanswered messages, the read receipts mocking me. I opened a new text to Daniel, typed out 6 different versions, and deleted them all. Finally, I just wrote, "Call me." I didn't expect a response. I didn't get one. The late afternoon sun was starting to disappear behind the buildings across the street, casting the foyer into shadow. I could stay here, in this beautiful prison, and wait for people who didn't want me to see how little I mattered. Or I could leave, go to a hotel, spend money I didn't need to spend, and prove I was exactly as irrelevant as they assumed. Or I could do something else entirely. I pulled up my contacts and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in almost a year, Edward Shaw, attorney, the man who'd handled my wife's estate after she passed, the man who'd quietly suggested, years later, that certain assets be protected in ways that made sense if you thought 3 moves ahead. The call connected on the second ring. Elias, Edward's voice was exactly as I remembered, calm, precise, faintly amused by everything. "This is unexpected." "I need some advice," I said, "and maybe something more than advice." "I see. Are you in trouble?" "Not yet, but I think I'm being set up for a kind of trouble that doesn't involve police." A pause. Then, "Where are you?" "Manhattan, Upper East Side, at my son's in-laws' house, except they're not here and he's not answering his phone." "Ah." Edward made a sound that might have been a sigh or a laugh. "That kind of trouble. Tell me what's happening." So I did. Not everything, not yet, but enough that he understood the shape of it. The invitation, the empty house, the cleaning woman's warning, the pattern of control that I was only now beginning to recognize. When I finished, Edward was quiet for a moment. "Elias, do you remember what I told you when we set up the trust documents? You said family is complicated. I said family is complicated, but paperwork is simple, and that if anything ever became too complicated, the simple solution would be there, waiting." I closed my eyes, remembering the folder on top of my filing cabinet, the documents I'd signed but never examined closely, the arrangements I'd made when Daniel was younger and I was thinking about worst-case scenarios. "I remember," I said. "Good. Now listen carefully. If they're testing you, let them. But understand what the test really is. It's not about whether you're worthy of their world. It's about whether they can erase you from your son's world. And that, Elias, is a test you don't have to pass or fail. You can simply refuse to take it." "How?" "By being very, very clear about what you control. Not what you own, not what you've given, what you control. And by making sure they understand that control doesn't disappear just because they want it to." I opened my eyes and looked at the polished marble, the expensive art, the careful arrangement of wealth meant to intimidate. "I need to think about this," I said. "Of course. But Elias, one more thing. Whatever you decide, don't do it for revenge. Do it for clarity. These people speak a language you don't use very often, but that doesn't mean you can't speak it when you need to." We talked for a few more minutes, going over details I'd half forgotten, confirming things that suddenly mattered more than I'd realized. By the time I hung up, the foyer was nearly dark, and I understood exactly what I had, what I'd given, and what I'd never actually surrendered. I picked up my bag and headed for the door. Upstairs, I heard Carolyn running water in one of the bathrooms. I thought about calling up to say goodbye, but decided against it. She'd done her part. The rest was mine. Outside, the street was quieter than I expected. I pulled out my phone and found a hotel 6 blocks away. Nothing fancy, nothing that tried to pretend it was more than it was. I booked a room for 2 nights, then started walking. The city moved around me, indifferent and endless. I was just another man with a bag, going somewhere that wasn't home, But for the first time since I'd landed in New York, I felt like I knew exactly where I was going. The hotel room was small and clean and honest about what it was. No marble floors, no art that required interpretation, no silence that felt like judgment, just a bed, a desk, a window facing a brick wall, and a bathroom where the fixtures worked without trying to impress anyone. I dropped my bag and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. It was almost 7. No messages from Daniel, no calls from Brielle. Nothing from Harold or Margaret, who'd never had my number in the first place. I should have been angry, part of me was. But mostly I felt something colder and more useful, clarity. I thought about Carolyn's words. They're evaluating. As if I were a candidate for a position I'd never applied for. As if my relationship with my own son was contingent on approval from people who measured value in square footage and stock portfolios. I pulled out my laptop and opened files I hadn't looked at in months. Financial records mostly, tax returns, business accounts. The folder Edward had helped me organize years ago, when Daniel was fresh out of college and struggling to find his footing. That was when the money had started flowing. Not handouts, I'd never believed in those, but help. A loan for the security deposit on Daniel's first apartment, another loan when his car broke down and fixing it cost more than the car was worth. A third loan when he wanted to take a coding boot camp that promised job placement but required tuition up front. Except they weren't loans, not really. I'd called them that because Daniel had insisted on calling them that, had promised to pay me back, had even set up a spreadsheet to track what he owed, but I'd never asked for repayment. Never mentioned it. And after a while, Daniel stopped mentioning it too. Then Brielle entered the picture. Suddenly Daniel didn't need help anymore. Suddenly he had a nice apartment. Their apartment, he'd corrected me when I'd asked about it. Suddenly he wore different clothes, ate at restaurants I'd never heard of, talked about investments and opportunities. I'd been happy for him. Proud, even. My son had made it. Found someone who could give him the stability I'd tried to provide but never quite managed, not in the way he needed. Except now, sitting in this hotel room, I realized stability wasn't what Brielle had given him. Security wasn't what her parents had offered. They'd given him dependence dressed up as success, and he'd taken it because it looked so much better than what he'd had before. I closed the laptop and called Edward again. Still thinking? He asked. Done thinking. Tell me about the properties. Papers rustled on his end. Which ones? The commercial unit in Vermont or the residential properties? All of it. Edward's voice took on the precise tone he used when reading legal documents. You currently hold primary interest in 3 rental properties in your home state, free and clear. You also hold secondary interest in a commercial property in Vermont, split 70-30 with the original purchaser, who is... Daniel, I finished, who put down the deposit using money I gave him. Money you loaned him, yes, with documentation stating repayment terms that were never enforced but remain legally valid. I rubbed my eyes. Edward, tell me the truth. If I wanted to, could I execute on those terms? Absolutely. The paperwork is clean, the agreements are signed, whether you choose to is a personal decision, but the legal framework is there. What would that actually mean? Practically? He paused. It would mean that properties currently titled in Daniel's name, acquired partially through your financial assistance, would be subject to your primary claim. In simpler terms, you could make a strong case that you hold controlling interest in assets he believes are his. I thought about the wedding, where Harold had talked extensively about real estate investment strategies, where he'd mentioned the importance of building a portfolio young, where he'd looked at Daniel like a project that was coming along nicely. What about the trust? I asked. Still intact, still structured exactly as we set it up. You have full control over dispersal and terms. Nothing has changed there unless you've modified it. I haven't. Then it remains as originally drafted, which means certain provisions become enforceable under certain conditions. I didn't need him to elaborate. I remembered the conversation we'd had when setting it up, how Edward had said, if you ever need to protect him from himself, this gives you that option. How I'd signed the papers thinking I'd never need them, that they were just precautions against a future that wouldn't arrive. I need to see you, I said. Tomorrow. Can you do that? I'm in Connecticut. I can meet you in the city tomorrow afternoon. Where? He gave me an address in Midtown, a firm I'd never heard of, but he assured me had conference rooms where we could talk privately. Bring everything, he said before hanging up. Every document, every record, every piece of paper that connects you to Daniel's current situation. We'll need it all. After he hung up, I sat in the silence of the hotel room and tried to figure out how I felt. The anger was there, but distant. What I felt most strongly was something like grief, not for what was lost, but for what had never existed in the first place. The version of family I'd thought we had, where love wasn't conditional and help didn't come with hidden audits. I ordered food from a small place down the street. Chinese food, the kind that arrived in sturdy cardboard containers that didn't pretend to be anything fancy. It tasted exactly the way it should have. Salty, warm, familiar. The kind of meal that asks nothing from you except that you sit still long enough to finish it. While I ate, I pulled up the text thread with Daniel again. Months of messages scrolled past my thumb. Hey, Dad. Quick question. Can't talk long, but wanted to check in. Sorry, busy week. Call you soon. Things are crazy right now. We'll catch up later. Every message polite, every message careful, every message trimmed down to the bare minimum, like he was rationing attention instead of giving it freely. Distance wrapped in courtesy, absence disguised as thoughtfulness. And my replies? Always the same tone, always understanding. No problem, kiddo. Whenever you have time. Love you. I'd never pushed, never asked why weeks passed without a real conversation. Never said that a phone works both ways. I'd taught myself to accept scraps with a smile. I set the phone down beside the empty container and finished eating. The food was good, better than I expected. But the silence that filled the room afterward was better still. It didn't lie. It didn't pretend to be busy. By 10 o'clock, I was in bed, staring up at the ceiling, tracing the faint shadows where the light from the street leaked in through the curtains. I thought about the house I'd built with my own hands after my wife passed, about how every beam, every measurement, every mistake corrected along the way had been part of learning how to keep going. I thought about raising Daniel alone, teaching him how to hold a hammer properly, how to measure twice and cut once, how to fix things instead of throwing them away, how real value came from effort, patience, and knowing what something was worth because you'd earned it, not because it looked impressive from the outside. My thoughts drifted to the workshop, the smell of sawdust, the hours spent building furniture for clients whose names meant nothing to Daniel and never had, pieces that ended up in offices and homes I'd never see again, a business that grew quietly, steadily, without headlines or announcements, while my son went off to college believing his father barely scraped by repairing broken chairs. I'd never corrected him. I'd told myself it was the right thing to do, that letting him believe I struggled would make his achievements feel like his own, that he wouldn't feel like he was walking in my shadow or riding on my success. I wanted him to be proud of himself, not grateful to me, not dependent, not obligated. At the time, it felt generous. Now, lying there in the dark, I wondered if it had been a mistake. If by minimizing what I'd built, I'd minimized myself. If I'd taught him, without meaning to, that I was optional, that I didn't require much attention, that I'd always be there, quietly waiting, no matter how long he took to remember me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Finally. My hand moved before I thought about it. I grabbed the phone, already expecting Daniel's name on the screen. A late apology, a quick call, something. It wasn't him. It was Brielle. Hi, Elias. Hope you're settling in okay. We'll see you tomorrow evening. And dinner at 7. Wear something nice. The smiley face didn't feel friendly. It felt sharp, deliberate, like it was meant to remind me of my place in the arrangement. I stared at the message longer than necessary, letting the words sit there, unmoving, undeniable. Then I typed back, looking forward to it. Before I could stop myself, I added my own smiley face. It felt like loading a gun. Morning came with pale light through thin curtains. I'd slept better than I expected, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that follows a decision you know is right, even if you don't yet know all its implications. I showered, dressed, and went downstairs to the hotel's breakfast area. Coffee from a carafe, toast from a basket, nothing trying to be more than it was. A couple of business travelers sat at separate tables, staring at their phones. A family with young kids took up 3 tables pushed together, the chaos of children somehow comforting in its honesty. I sat alone near the window and opened my laptop. 2 hours until I needed to meet Edward. Time to review everything one more time, make sure I understood exactly what I had and what it meant. The commercial property in Vermont came first. Daniel had found it 5 years ago, right after he'd finished the coding boot camp. It was a small storefront in a college town divided into 3 units, a coffee shop, a bookstore, and a yoga studio. The building was old but solid, and the location was good. Daniel had been so excited, so convinced it would be his entry into passive income. The deposit had been $25,000. I'd given it to him with the understanding that when the property turned profitable, he'd pay me back with interest. We'd signed papers. Edward had drawn them up, made it all legitimate. Daniel was listed as the primary owner, but the lien in my favor was clear and enforceable. The property had done well. Better than expected, actually. The tenants were stable, the rent covered the mortgage plus maintenance, and Daniel had been proud of it. He'd called me every few months in those first years, giving updates, talking about expansion possibilities. Then Brielle came along, and the updates stopped. The property kept generating income, but Daniel stopped mentioning it. I pulled up the current records, still titled to him, still carrying the original lien, still generating around $3,000 a month in positive cash flow. The residential properties were smaller but more numerous. 2 rental units in town, a duplex about 40 minutes from my house. All purchased during Daniel's mid-20s when he was trying to build wealth the way the books told him to. All purchased with down payments that came from my account, structured as loans, documented properly. Total value, conservatively, around $400,000. Daniel's equity, assuming he counted all the down payment money as his, maybe $150,000. My documented claim, $230,000 plus interest. Not enough to ruin him, but enough to make his current lifestyle impossible if suddenly called. I closed the laptop and finished my coffee. The question wasn't whether I could do this. The legal framework was clear. The question was whether I should, and what doing so would actually accomplish. The family with kids left in a burst of motion and noise. One of the business travelers followed. I sat alone, watching the street outside, thinking about Edward's words. Don't do it for revenge. Do it for clarity. At 11:30, I packed up and headed to Midtown. Edward's office was in one of those buildings that looked like every other office building in Manhattan. Glass and steel and anonymous corporate dignity. The lobby had security that checked IDs, elevators that required badge access, and a distinct feeling that everyone knew where they belonged. I gave my name to the reception desk. 5 minutes later, Edward appeared. He looked exactly as I remembered, early 60s, gray hair cut precisely, suit that probably cost more than most people spent on clothes in a year, but wore it like it was nothing special. His handshake was firm without being aggressive. Elias, good to see you. Come on back. He led me through a maze of corridors to a conference room with a view of other buildings. Inside, he already had files spread across the table. My files, pulled from storage or his own records. Coffee? He offered. I'm good. He closed the door and we sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Edward folded his hands on the table and looked at me with the kind of direct attention that made you understand why people paid him to give advice. Before we start, he said, I need to make sure you're thinking clearly. You came here angry, but you're not angry now. You came here looking for leverage, but leverage only works if you're willing to use it. Are you? I don't know yet, I said honestly. But I want to understand what using it would look like. He nodded. Fair enough. Let's walk through it. For the next hour, Edward explained in precise detail what I controlled, what I could enforce, and what the realistic outcomes would be. The properties could be called, but not seized immediately. The process would take months, require legal notice, and give Daniel time to respond. If he could refinance or find other financing, he could buy me out. If he couldn't, the properties would need to be sold or surrendered. The trust was more complicated. It was structured to provide for Daniel's future, retirement, emergency funds, that kind of thing. But the terms I'd set up gave me broad discretion over how and when those funds became available. I could modify distributions, I could add conditions, I could make his access contingent on certain requirements being met. Like what? I asked. That's up to you. Could be as simple as maintaining regular contact, could be more specific, living independently, making certain financial decisions without external influence, demonstrating autonomy. Could I make it contingent on him not being financially dependent on his in-laws? Edward raised an eyebrow. That's aggressive. But yes, you could structure it that way. You'd need to be careful with the language, make sure it's enforceable, but fundamentally the trust is yours to modify as you see fit, within reason. I leaned back in my chair. What would happen if I did all of this? Called the loans, restructured the trust, made it clear that his financial foundation isn't as solid as he thinks? Honestly, he'd be upset. His wife would be furious. Her parents would likely get involved, possibly offer to buy you out just to remove you from the equation. Your relationship with your son would be strained, possibly permanently. But he'd be forced to confront where his money actually came from. Yes. Edward paused. Elias, I have to ask, what do you actually want out of this? Because if it's just to prove a point, there are simpler ways. But if you're trying to change the dynamic, to reset the relationship on more honest terms, then this might work. It's scorched earth, but sometimes scorched earth is what's needed to clear out the rot and start fresh. I thought about the empty house, the unanswered messages, the careful distance Daniel had maintained, the way he'd traded independence for comfort and convinced himself it was success. I want him to understand that what he has isn't free, I said finally. That the safety net he thinks his in-laws provided is actually mine. That if he's going to choose their world over mine, he should at least know what he's giving up. Edward studied me for a long moment. Then he pulled a legal pad toward him and picked up a pen. All right, he said. Let's draft the notices. We worked for another 2 hours, going over language, confirming details, making sure everything was airtight. By the time we finished, I had a folder of documents that would, when filed and served, fundamentally alter Daniel's understanding of his own financial position. When do you want to execute? Edward asked. I'm having dinner with them tonight. The Langfords, Brielle, probably Daniel if he ever resurfaces. Let me see how that goes first. And if it goes badly, then I'll let you know tomorrow morning. Edward nodded. He put the documents in a sealed envelope and handed it to me. Keep this safe. If you decide to move forward, call me and I'll handle the filing. If you decide not to, destroy it, and we never had this conversation. We shook hands. I left the building with the envelope in my bag, feeling like I was carrying something more dangerous than paper. Outside, the city was loud with midday traffic. I had 6 hours until dinner. 6 hours to decide if I was actually going to blow up my son's life in the name of teaching him a lesson he might never thank me for. I found a quiet coffee shop and sat in the back corner, the envelope on the table in front of me. My phone buzzed. Finally, Daniel. Hey, Dad. Sorry I've been MIA. Crazy week at work. See you tonight at the house? Looking forward to it. No explanation. No acknowledgement that I'd been standing in his in-law's empty house yesterday, waiting like a servant for masters who'd never planned to be there. Just casual, breezy distance, like everything was normal. I typed back, see you then. Then I opened the envelope and read through the documents one more time, making sure I understood exactly what I was holding. By the time I finished my coffee, I knew what I was going to do. The taxi dropped me in front of the Langford house at 6:45. 15 minutes early, but I'd learned a long time ago that being early meant you controlled the entrance, not them. The front door was answered by Harold Langford himself. He was exactly as I remembered from the wedding. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome 30 years ago and was now just well-maintained. He wore slacks and a dress shirt with no tie, the casual uniform of men who never had to try. Elias! His handshake was firm, practiced, empty. So glad you could make it. Come in, come in. I stepped into the foyer. It looked exactly as it had yesterday, except now it was occupied. Margaret appeared from the living room, perfectly put together in black pants and a silk blouse that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in 5 years. Elias, wonderful to see you. Her hug was the kind that involved no actual contact, just shoulders touching briefly while air kissed near cheeks. How was your flight? Fine. And the house? I hope you were comfortable. It was very quiet. Something flickered across her face, too quick to read. Yes. Well, we were unavoidably detained upstate, property matter that couldn't wait. But you're here now, and that's what matters. Brielle emerged from the kitchen, and behind her, finally, Daniel. My son looked good. Better than good. He wore a button-down shirt that fit perfectly, dark jeans that somehow looked formal, and an expression that was trying very hard to be casual. When he saw me, his smile was genuine but brief. Hey, Dad. Hey, kiddo. We hugged. It felt real for about half a second, then became performance. He stepped back and gestured vaguely toward the dining room. We thought we'd eaten tonight. Mom's been cooking. He said Mom, meaning Margaret, and something in my chest went cold. How domestic, I said. We moved to the dining room. The table that could seat 12 had been set for 5, all of us clustered at one end like we were playing at intimacy. Harold took the head, naturally. Margaret sat to his right, Brielle across from her, Daniel next to Brielle, me at the far end, positioned like an afterthought. The food appeared, salmon, roasted vegetables, some kind of grain I didn't recognize. Wine was poured. Harold made a show of asking if I preferred red or white, as if my preference mattered in a house where every bottle probably cost more than my monthly utility bill. So, Elias, Harold began, cutting into his salmon with surgical precision. Daniel tells us you work with furniture? I make furniture, I corrected. Custom pieces mostly, some restoration work. How interesting. And is that something you've done long? 26 years. Margaret made a sound of polite interest. What a lovely craft. Very hands-on. The way she said hands-on made it sound like a limitation. It pays the bills, I said simply. Of course, of course. Harold nodded like I'd confirmed something. There's real value in skilled trades. The world needs people who can actually build things. People, Not men like you and me. People. Speaking of building, I said, keeping my tone light. Daniel, how's the Vermont property doing? The commercial building? Daniel looked up from his plate, surprised. Oh, it's fine. Good, actually. Tenants are solid. That's right. You mentioned you had some investments, Harold said, his interest suddenly more focused. Real estate is smart. We've always encouraged Brielle to think long-term about asset building. Daniel's quite good at it, I said. Picked it up young. That Vermont property has been generating steady income for 5 years now. Has it really? Margaret looked at Daniel with something like pride. You never mentioned that, sweetheart. Daniel shifted in his seat. It's not that big a deal. Just one building. Still, property ownership at your age is impressive, Harold continued. Most young people these days are drowning in student debt, renting, no real equity. You're ahead of the curve. I took a bite of salmon. It was perfectly cooked, perfectly seasoned, perfectly joyless. He had a good foundation, I said. We set him up early. We? Brielle's voice was sharp. His mother and I, before she passed. I looked at Daniel. You remember those conversations, kiddo, about building wealth slowly, making smart investments, not over-leveraging. Daniel nodded, but his expression had gone carefully neutral. Yeah, I remember. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman, Margaret said, her tone conveying sympathy without actual feeling. She was practical, I said. Made sure our son understood money, where it came from, what it cost to make. The conversation moved on. Harold talked about a development project in Connecticut. Brielle mentioned a charity gala coming up. Margaret discussed travel plans. They were thinking of spending spring in Europe. Daniel said very little, just nodded and smiled and played his role as the son-in-law who fit. I watched him, watched how he held his fork, how he laughed at Harold's mediocre jokes, how he deferred to Brielle when she spoke. This wasn't the kid I'd raised. This was someone else wearing my son's face. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Coffee appeared, served in cups so delicate I was afraid to hold them. Harold positioned himself near the window, standing in that way rich men stand, claiming space without effort. So, Elias, he said, swirling his coffee like it was brandy. Daniel's told us a bit about you, but I'd love to hear more. What does a furniture maker actually do all day? The question was designed to sound interested while communicating that he couldn't actually imagine what my life was like. I build things people need, I said. Design them, construct them, finish them. Sometimes people want something specific that can't be bought in a store. That's what I do. And business is good? Steady? That's wonderful. Steady is important, especially in uncertain times. I sipped my coffee. It was excellent. Everything here was excellent, in the way that things are excellent when price is no object. Harold's being modest, Margaret said from the couch. His business is more than steady. He's developing 3 properties right now, all in prime locations. 4, Harold corrected. We just closed on a mixed-use project in Stamford. Brielle beamed. Dad's projects are incredible. You should see the renderings. I nodded politely. Daniel, are you involved in any of that? My son looked up, startled. Me? No, I'm still in tech. Software development. Still working remote? Yeah, mostly. From here? A pause. Too long. Sometimes. We have an apartment downtown, too. Your apartment, you mean? I asked Brielle. She blinked. Sorry. The apartment downtown. Is it yours, or is it in both your names? It's... She glanced at Daniel, then at her father. It's a family property. We're using it while we figure out our permanent situation. So not yours, I said pleasantly. The room went very quiet. Dad? Daniel said, his voice tight. What are you doing? Just trying to understand where you actually live, kiddo. Here at your in-laws' house or downtown in a family property, because it doesn't sound like you have your own place. Harold set down his coffee cup. Elias, I think you might be misunderstanding the situation. Young couples today face different challenges than our generation did. Supporting them while they establish themselves is just good parenting. Is it? I looked at him directly. Or is it a way of keeping them dependent? Margaret stood up. I think this conversation has gotten off track. Has it? I remained seated, calm, my voice level. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems pretty clear. You invited me here to evaluate whether I was worthy of being in your world, whether I met your standards, whether I'd fit into the narrative you've built around my son. That's not, Brielle started. It is, I interrupted. Your cleaning woman told me. You do this. Invite people to stay in your house while you're gone, see how they behave, decide if they're acceptable. It's a test. and I was supposed to either pass by being appropriately grateful and invisible, or fail by being too comfortable, too present, too much of a reminder that Daniel didn't come from this. Daniel was staring at me, his face pale. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you called me from their script, that you've been avoiding me for months, that you stopped asking for my advice the minute you started taking their money. And yes, Daniel, I said their money. Because everything you have, the Vermont property, the rental units, the down payments that made all of it possible, that came from me, not them." "You gave me that money," Daniel said, his voice rising. "You said it was a gift?" "I said it was help. We signed papers, kiddo. Legal papers that your mother's attorney drew up. Every dollar has a document attached." Harold's expression had gone cold. "Are you threatening your own son?" "I'm clarifying." I pulled the envelope from my jacket pocket and set it on the coffee table. "These are notices of intent regarding several loans made over the past 8 years. Loans totaling $230,000, plus interest, all documented, all enforceable. They're currently in default, as no payments have been made and no requests for extension have been filed." Daniel reached for the envelope, his hands shaking. "You can't be serious." "Open it." He did. His face went from pale to ashen as he read. Brielle grabbed the papers from him, scanning quickly, her expression shifting from confusion to fury. "This is extortion," she spat. "It's accounting," I corrected. "Your parents made you think you were independent, but you're not. The foundation you're standing on, that's mine. The properties generating income, mine. The trust fund you think will be there for your future, also mine, and structured in ways that require you to actually be my son, not their project." "I am your son," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "Then act like it." I stood up. "Stop letting these people control your life because they have more money. Stop pretending you built something they paid for. Stop avoiding me because I embarrass you in front of your wife's parents." "That's not—" "It is." I looked at Harold and Margaret, who were frozen in wealthy person rage, the kind that couldn't explode because that would be undignified. "You wanted to test me? Congratulations. I failed. I don't fit your world. I don't dress right, don't talk right, don't have the right kind of money. But I have something you don't. Actual claim to my son's life. Legal, documented, enforceable claim. So here's how this works. Daniel either starts making payments on those loans and becomes actually independent, or I execute on them, and everything he thinks he owns disappears. His choice, not yours." "You can't do this," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "Watch me." I picked up my jacket. "Daniel, you've got 60 days to make a decision. You can refinance through a bank, you can ask your in-laws for help, which would make your dependence on them complete, or you can talk to me like I'm your father instead of an embarrassment and we'll figure something out together. But the days of pretending my help was a gift while treating me like a stranger are over." I walked to the foyer. Behind me, silence. Then Daniel's voice, small and broken. "Dad, please." I stopped but didn't turn around. "Please don't do this." "I'm not doing anything, kiddo. I'm just making visible what was always true. You want to live in their world? Fine. But you'll do it honestly, on terms everyone can see, not buried under polite fictions and unanswered phone calls." I opened the front door and stepped out into the evening air. Behind me, I heard Brielle's voice rising, Margaret trying to calm her, Harold already on his phone, probably calling his own attorney. But I also heard Daniel crying. I closed the door and walked down the steps to the street. My phone was already ringing. Edward, probably, alerted by some automated system that I'd actually gone through with it. I didn't answer. I just walked toward the subway, leaving behind the house and its perfect silence, and the family that had tried to erase me using money and distance and the assumption that I'd never fight back. They'd been wrong.